How's it going, folks? I'm Kowalski. Welcome to Prairie Fire. I'm reporting from the South Channel of the Platte River. Um, I decided to take a break from working on a fence down here to talk a little bit about why farmers voted the way they did, or more generally, why rural areas voted the way they did, seemingly against their own interests for the last, let's call it 35 years or so. I feel like I should be concerned that we are in the middle of December and I'm able to go outside in central Nebraska in a short sleeved shirt. I'm sure that's not an ominous warning at all. All right, so it's no secret for about the last 35 years, farmers have been a pretty solid voting base for the Republican Party. And this, to many on the outside, seems extremely strange considering how often Republicans tend to vote against the interests of farmers on the national level. I can't speak to all local elections. Sometimes you do end up with good local politicians, but on the whole, the national ones have been pretty bad when it comes to agricultural policy in general. They tend to support monopolies over small family farms. They don't tend to do anything to cap large companies from doing land speculation. Um, just generally, they have not had any type of major plan for rural reinvestment to try to build up small towns. As I have made it quite clear, my primary interest will always be to rebuild our small communities because they were devastated in the Great Depression. They were devastated in the farm crisis of the 80s. They have not recovered, and this keeps leading to a perpetual just rural flight. And this will just keep draining our capacity to do anything outside of mechanized agriculture in the northern part of the United States, with the exception of like the coastal orchards. So, to explain why farmers vote the way they do, I kind of want to talk about Plato's analogy of the man in the cave. So, in this, Plato is trying to explain that if you took a person for their entire life and put them in a cave to where they could only view a wall, and how you shared information with them was just doing a light puppet show. Like you cast the light behind you, you make images on the wall, and that's how you communicated to this person. That person's perspective of reality would be completely predicated on the information they receive in that way. So they would not understand the actual world. Like if you go in there and then pulled them out of the cave and brought them into the actual world where people, walk around, communicate verbally, not just with visualization, their entire perspective of reality would be completely shattered. And when you pull somebody out of that, a lot of times they will retreat back into what they know because that would be horrifying to have your entire world shattered like that. In some ways, this is how life is for people in rural America post the 1980s farm crisis, because most of our media has been completely just consumed by conservative media, particularly corporate conservative right wing media. It first started out with talk radio, which then morphed into satellite radio talking heads. And now today, it's becoming more of a right wing podcast because each one of these kept feeding into the other. Now, some of you might say, well, okay, I understand that maybe your reality has been altered by this complete domination of your media. But certainly your lived experience, like the trade war of 2018, would be, piercing the veil. It would be pulling you out of the cave and showing you what the real world is. And you would recognize that Republicans do not necessarily have your best interest at heart. But the problem is they were told that it worked. You can go look this up. Right wing commentators, Tim Pool, for instance, said that Trump won the 2018 trade war, and that's why prices were falling in 2019. Um, a lot of right wing talk radio guys were all saying that too. They said we won the trade war, that it was painful, but we succeeded. And if you don't have a counter narrative to that, that's reality. We won. If you are stuck in an echo chamber and just to understand how horrible these echo chambers are, if you went and talked to your neighbor, if you went to town to go to, like, say, one of the mechanic shops or, just like a business to business establishment getting parts and stuff, over the radio, you will have just talk radio going. Uh, Hopefully sports. I think sports are probably a better background sound than talk radio. And it's all reinforcing the same thing. The trade war is winning. Tax cuts are good. Deregulation is good. It's good for all of you, and it's working. If that is what you keep hearing every single day, and there is no counter narrative to it, eventually, if you think you personally are experiencing bad financial situations, that's a personal failing because everyone else is saying how better the system is. I've mentioned before that farmers are not necessarily workers. It's better to think of us as owner operators or small business people. Um, in a captured media environment, if you wanted to support more corporate interests, you would advocate to people who are small businesses that it is in your interest to have tax cuts. It's in your interest to have deregulation. Now, in the short run, this is called juicing the economy. Yes, in the short run, that will increase your financial well-being. The problem is that completely undermines civilization building. Um, when you lower taxes, you end up creating consolidation of wealth because instead of taxing the people at the very top more in order to pay for basic infrastructure, we're instead limiting ourselves at building infrastructure. And those at the very top now have more power to then pay for politicians who, in turn, will lower their taxes even further or lower regulations, which ultimately make the environment worse. And then we all collectively as a society have to pay for the cleanups of these problems. It's just not good for small businesses in the long run. And if you have a captured media that does not talk about the negatives and only focuses on the positives, what are people going to decide at the election? So when you have these captured media and all rural America is getting broadcasted in is that, oh, do you remember the good old days prior to COVID when Trump was president and the price of gasoline was low? When farming was doing a lot better, when your inputs weren't so expensive, when inflation was down and interest rates were lower and you could borrow more money and you just felt more security. That was the message being broadcast every single day without anyone challenging it, at least not on a scale that could actually pierce this echo chamber. It is a very isolated system. People in cities may not fully appreciate how much more information they get just by being around more people. I mean, you go into the streets and there's a protest. If there's a protest going on, you might look into it. You might see, oh, there's a political issue going on here that I need to look into. There's a greater variety of people, so there's a greater variety of information. You are just cognitively more aware of things going on. If you are in a relatively low population area, you're not going to see as many protests. You're also not going to see as many people outside of like blue collar jobs. You're going to see more people in the service sector. That's more communication with people around you. That's more people in sales. There's just more communication in urban areas. In many red states, for instance, where are you going to have some of your most informed segments of your population? Probably in the college towns, just because there is a spike in the population, a diversity of people, a diversity of viewpoints, and therefore more communications going on. It's just an easier way to communicate with one another. And then echo chambers breed more isolation because if you are living in a subset of reality, which a lot of people in rural areas are, it is difficult to communicate with people outside of that area. So it is a feedback loop, and there is nothing piercing this. Well, folks, I think that pretty much explains why people voted the way they did. If you liked the video, well, wait, no. Now that I think about it, there's a whole other half of this story that a lot of people tend to forget about. And that's why isn't there a counter narrative in rural areas? You know, isn't that kind of strange? So, why are Democrats not piercing this echo chamber? Well, they kind of are. About a third of rural areas do vote for the Democrats. And I mean, that kind of makes sense because, information still would trickle through. You have a few inquisitive people who have gone to universities, or maybe they were in the military and they were exposed to a wider variety of people and ideas, and they've heard different sources of information. Maybe they live close enough to a larger community where they're exposed to more people. Maybe they just had a phenomenal teacher that opened their minds to more possibilities. But why aren't the Democrats working with some sort of plan in place to communicate to rural areas? Because they're the only ones with a large enough institutional force to actually break this monopoly hold on information. So I'm going to show you this clip from everyone's favorite Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, and his strategy on rural outreach.
That for every, this is the second point, for every blue collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2, 3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin. Uh, the voters who are most out there figuring out what to do are not the blue collar Democrats. They are the college educated Republicans who lean Republican or are independent and in the suburbs.
So his whole strategy is to completely abandon rural areas because he believes he could have gotten a 2-to-1 margin increase in votes from the suburbs and city cores. Um, is he insane? Okay, let's ignore the fact that he doesn't want to do rural outreach in general. Maybe it would be a lost cause in, like, say, Arkansas, Oklahoma, maybe even here in Nebraska. He was referring to Pennsylvania, a swing state. Rural outreach there could pay massive dividends in a federal election. The Senate seats there flip easily. The presidential electoral college votes can flip easily. You would think that in a swing state, he would want to be firing on all cylinders, trying to maximize the amount of votes that he can get out of the place, but he doesn't. And if you're doing rural outreach in a place like Pennsylvania, that can just have natural bleed on effects to other parts of the country because rural areas across the board are all facing very similar issues. Another issue we have is that a lot of politicians are just not good at creating narratives. So, for instance, one of the reasons a lot of people in the suburbs and in rural places voted for Trump was because people associated Trump with low gas prices. In 2019 and 2020, gasoline was fairly cheap. It was close to $2. That was before the pandemic when all the supply shocks hit. So people thought, oh, his policies led to cheap energy prices. That was good for me. It meant I had more money for food. I had more money for luxuries. Going on vacation was a lot cheaper. His policies must have led to good times. But was gas cheap because of Trump's policies? Arguably, no. Gasoline was cheap in the United States because there was a surplus of oil. Was it because Trump opened up more oil leases? Not really. It was because of a massive spike in oil production thanks to the Obama administration opening up fracking across the country. And his policy of quantitative easing really helped turbocharge that. So I can go and find sources. I might look one up real quick.
So I found this PowerPoint from the U.S. Energy Information Administration dated April 14th, 2015, and it talks about U.S. energy imports, and it states that we would no longer be a net importer of fuels for the first time since the 1950s by the end of 2030. This is due to an increase in the production of crude from tight formations. This is what fracking is all about. And it's saying that they are expecting growth here until 2020. The United States goes from being a net importer to a net exporter of natural gas by 2017. A lot of the increase in the energy production comes from shale, but it also shows that there is an increase in the amount coming from renewables. So, yeah, this was 2 years before Trump even entered the White House for the first time, and we were already on course for being a net energy exporting superpower.
As early as 2015, because people in 2015 recognized, oh, this industry is absolutely booming. We are going to have an oil surplus. Had nothing to do with Trump's policies. It had nothing to do with many of these Republican policies. It was by and large quantitative easing, which made the initial investment into fracking more affordable. Did Democrats ever run on that? No. Why? Well, they're trying to cast a broad net and they wanted to perceive themselves as part of the environmental movement. So they didn't want to antagonize one part of their base. But you have to communicate this, otherwise, you lose other segments of the country. If you don't take credit for your successes, what are people supposed to believe? Speaking of very poor messaging, the Democrats suck at it even when they have successes. Biden's industrial build-out was pretty good. All things considered, manufacturing was going up in North America. We were seeing a greater proportion of manufacturing jobs. Uh, it was just, in general, really good investments. Did they really explain this to the American people? No, not really. And what did everybody become myopically focused on after 2022? The Ukraine war. Why? Because it triggered a spike in prices. Oil went up because we had to sanction the Russians. Did anybody really communicate this? No, not really. I would even say cynically, the Democrats never even pointed out that the war in Ukraine probably would not have happened had Trump not weakened the NATO alliance. The Russians looked at NATO and thought that it was a paper tiger because of how badly Trump was undermining our relationship with the Europeans. Right after COVID, I mean, it would probably seem pretty obvious to anyone at the time that NATO wasn't probably going to do anything. And then when the war kicks off, we fully back our commitment to defend Ukraine based on our 1993 agreement with them. And that caused a massive shock in prices around the globe. None of this was communicated, just poorly communicated. Was it because Biden was old and didn't really understand how to communicate that? Possibly, but that's why you have people in your administration to delegate that to. But that wasn't being sent out. And remember, rural areas have captured media. If you want to pierce right wing media in rural areas, you have to take a massive effort at doing so. And they just didn't. I'm not trying to suggest that farmers and, rural people in general are completely blameless for their decisions of seemingly voting against their own interests, but it's not that simple. There's always the instinctive urge to do this whenever I'm at the river. Love it. One of the best politicians I've seen recently at creating a narrative has been Zoran Mamdani. He is the current mayor-elect of New York City, and when running for office, he had a very clear and concise agenda. He wanted to make New York City more affordable for the people who actually live there. He wants to get rid of food deserts with a city-run grocery store concept, very similar to what they have down in Kansas. And he wanted to make public transportation fast and cheap, clear, concise, and in the Democratic primary, he won in a landslide. It was a good communication effort, and he seems to be following through on this. And what did the Democratic establishment do? They did not back him. They decided instead to back the failure of a governor, Andrew Cuomo, who was also running in the race. And they backed him when he ran as an independent candidate in the general election. The Democratic establishment backed a challenger to the Democratic nominee in the country's largest city, a mayorship that is probably more powerful than the governorship of like half of our states. Why did they do that? Because he was not going to toe the corporate party line. He wants to actually use his office to better the lives of people. So, voting is not the end all be all of politics. A lot of politics involves institution building, and that's just something Democrats aren't doing in rural areas. Um, they haven't in a very long time. And in that clip with Chuck Schumer, if they're not even willing to do it in a swing state, what hope is there in other parts of the country? So when people are blaming the voter, I just have to ask, what was the alternative? Who's the other option? Because we are being held in place by captured media. The one thing big enough to pierce that has no interest in doing so. And the captured media is broadcasting that there is this one guy who can come in and fix all the problems and bring back the good times that we have talked about. What are we as individual voters supposed to do in that situation? Um, this is not just a rural issue. This is an urban one as well. The corporate Dems have abandoned the working class just as much as the Republicans have. And though Democrats tend to not be quite as explicit with, just handing the keys over to corporate interests, they were still in the previous administrations. I mean, let's not forget, quantitative easing under Barack Obama is what built the current tech sector into what it is. This massive behemoth that can swing elections with how much power they have amassed with all this cheap cash. And they just tend to back who's ever in charge. They don't care that they're not loyal. Why would they be loyal? Something that I have to put up with all the time whenever discussing anything related to politics is the culture war. That is something that conservative media always goes to, and it is so mind-numbingly stupid. Um, it's just a red herring. It doesn't serve any purpose. It is just used to distract people and fill them with hate and rage. You can talk for hours with people in rural areas, and they will all agree with you. Monopolies are bad. We need to rein them in, raise taxes on the rich, and then it always devolves into, why do trans people have rights? Where did that even come from? Why should they have rights? Because they're people. Because that's your basic liberty as a human being within the borders of the United States. These divisions are used to great effect at keeping the working class divided and keeping small businesses at odds with the working class. And as long as we stay divided, all of our wealth will keep getting pillaged. Our society will continue to decline because we can't maintain our infrastructure. So this seems like a bit of a downer of a video. So what are any positives out of this? Well, like I mentioned earlier, Mamdani is a positive one. Katie Wilson out of Seattle is a good one. There is some movement being made across a lot of our major cities all over the nation. And just generally speaking, a lot of people are getting very fed up with this current system. So there is probably a good chance that we will see political change over the next few years. But, just get active in your local politics. Try to communicate solutions to the problems around you. Here in Nebraska, we desperately need to diversify our economy. That's something that I think everyone can easily see. We are way too dependent on agriculture. I think there could be an avenue for energy development out here. A lot of space, nuclear energy. We could invest in that all over the place. It would be a good diversification. Energy right dead center of the country, powering different parts of the national grid. We already have a lot of wind farms. We need to be building those power systems. Like, it's something we could look into. It's something we could do locally. I might talk about that more in a future video, but Generally speaking, I think people need to think about the problems in their local community that you could maybe do locally or at a state level and go from there. Because it just seems like until one of the major parties is willing to admit that they have to back the working class, we are just going to see a uniparty hell bent on defending corporate interests at all costs. Well, I think that's it for now, folks. I hope you found this interesting. I'm sure there's going to be some interesting comments. From here on out, I'm probably only going to respond to comments for like the first day or so. It's a bit tedious going through that. I try to answer questions because I do feel like this channel needs to be dedicated towards educating people. But yeah, until the next one, I will catch you later. You can't tell because that island's obscuring it, but this river is about 3 feet deep, but a mile wide. It's perfect.